Okay, so this is John Forsey, and I am your instructor for this course. And this video is meant to prepare you for the premise assignments for this course. The logic that we're going to be using for these premise assignments, um, the way to think about it, I think that's most helpful, is certain ideas logically leading to other ideas. In other words, the logic that we're going to learn says that if you have a certain set of ideas or propositions or beliefs or something like that, that logically means you have to have these other ideas. The ideas that lead to other ideas are called premises. And the ideas that are led to or that you end up with are called conclusions. And that's important because when you're working on these premise assignments, one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is argue in favor of or against the premises of an argument, but you will not be allowed to, excuse me, you will not be allowed to argue in favor of or against the conclusions. Let's look at another image of the sort of thing that I have in mind. Here on the screen, you can see that you have several ideas, ideas 1 through 4. And what I'm saying in this image is that those ideas, ideas 1 through 4, are the premises of an argument. And what that means is that at least ideally, they should logically lead to idea number 5, the conclusion. All right, so how are we going to do this? In this class, for the premise assignments that you'll be working on, I am going to limit you to only 4 ways of moving from ideas to other ideas. And there are reasons why I'm limiting you in that way, but it's hard to get into them now. As you read your textbook, you will be given reasons for why I'm limiting you, especially in the chapters later on. So the 4 ways, the 4 rules of logic that you are limited to, as you can see, they are called modus ponens, that can be abbreviated with the letters MP. You have modus tollens, MT. You have hypothetical syllogism, HS. And you have disjunctive syllogism, DS. Let's now learn what these rules are, starting with the rule modus ponens. The rule modus ponens you can see symbolized with variables A and B. So let's look at it. Here's what modus ponens says. It says that if you have these ideas, 1 and 2, then that logically means that you have another idea, which is number 3. So modus ponens, the form that it takes is if A, then B, A, therefore B. That is what modus ponens is. Nothing else is modus ponens other than that form. Anything at all can go into the A slot, as it were, so long as you replicate it exactly in all the other A slots. And the same thing goes for the B slot. Anything can go in the B slot so long as you replicate it in all the other B slots. Let's take a look at an example. Here's an example of modus ponens. If I went to the store, then I bought milk. I went to the store, therefore I bought milk. One way of seeing what's going on is that if I write in here, if A, then B. This is A, where you're saying the exact same thing in the A slots. That's what you need to do. And you're saying the exact same things in the B slot as well. That's how you know that this is an example of modus tollens. So here's a question for you. Is this right here modus ponens? If I went to the store, then I bought milk. That starts off the same. But then it goes different. The form ends up being different because what it says is, I bought milk, therefore I went to the store. In other words, this says if A then B, and then here it says B when what it should say is A. And what it says here, I went to the store, that's the A slot. See how these two match each other? This means that if you were to write here, citing your rule, modus ponens 1 and 2, that would not be right because this is not modus ponens. Why is it not modus ponens? Because in order to be modus ponens, it has to fit the form of modus ponens exactly. All right, let's look at modus tollens. Here's the form of modus tollens. If A, then B. B is not the case, or B is false, or not B. In other words, you are denying B. You are negating B. Those are all the different ways of saying the same thing, like B is not the case or B is false. And then what you result in for your conclusion is A isn't the case, or A is false, or not A. You are denying A. So again, here we have premises, and if you have two premises that fit this form, logically, you are led to another idea, which is the conclusion. One thing to know, excuse me, is that whenever you have a conclusion, you always have to have the word therefore in front of it, and you always have to be able to cite a rule. You have to use one of the 4 rules. Modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, disjunctive syllogism. You have to use one of those 4 and to get to a conclusion. All right, so let's take a look at an example of modus tollens. Yeah, let me just unpack modus tollens in its form a little bit more. What's going on there is it's saying if A then B, and then it's denying the second part, which is B. It's negating that. And then what the rule says is that if you are negating the second part of a conditional, an if-then statement, if you're negating the part that comes after the word then, the first part in between the if and the then, in other words, the A slot, that's going to be negated. Let's take a look at it in a normal English example. If I went to the store, then I bought milk. But I didn't buy milk. Notice how I'm negating that. I'm saying that's false, right? Therefore, I didn't go to the store. That's modus tollens. If you use modus tollens to get to a conclusion, you put the word therefore, you cite modus tollens, you cite the premises that you used. You used 4 and 5. 4 and 5 are up here. That's how you did modus tollens. So is this modus tollens? If I went to the store, then I bought milk, but I didn't go to the store, therefore I didn't buy milk. That is not modus tollens because it doesn't fit the form of modus tollens exactly. Now, in this video, I'm not explaining to you why you have to fit the form of the rules that you're using exactly. But for now, for this assignment, you need to do that. Basically, I'm guaranteeing that whenever you use a rule, if you use it properly, I'm guaranteeing that the argument that you're using is always going to make logical sense. That may not make sense to you. If not, it's okay. The main thing that you need to know is I need to use these rules to make my arguments. Hypothetical syllogism. Here's how this rule goes. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. Now, one thing to note before I talk about this a little more is that you can have more links in this chain than just two. In other words, you can have if A then B, if B then C, if C then D, if D then E, and then your conclusion can be if A then E. So that's allowed, and that fits the form of hypothetical syllogism because I'm telling you here that it is okay to do, so you're allowed to do that if you ever want to do that. Basically, what's going on in this rule is you're stringing together a whole bunch of if-then statements. If then, and then you end with an if-then statement. If something, then something else. And then you take that second one and you say, well, if that thing, then another thing. And then you take that thing and you say, well, if that was true, then another thing would be true. And the way that you end this rule, the way that you come to the conclusion, is you say, if the very first link in the chain is right, then the very last link in the chain is right. Here's an example. If I went to the store, then I bought some milk. If I bought some milk, then I had some cereal. Therefore, if I went to the store, then I had some cereal. One thing to know about these examples is they are not meant to be reasoning that necessarily convinces you. They are just meant to illustrate the rule. So of course it's true that you could have gone to the store without buying milk. That's right, that's true. But if it were true that if you went to the store then you bought some milk, and if it were true that if you bought some milk then you had some cereal, of course, people can buy milk without eating cereal. But what this is saying is that if it were true that if I bought some milk then I had some cereal, then what you could conclude with the rule hypothetical syllogism is if I went to the store then I had some cereal. Is this hypothetical syllogism? Once again, no. If I went to the store then I bought some milk. If I bought some milk then I had some cereal. Those two parts fit the rule exactly, but this conclusion does not fit the rule exactly. One of the things that's most obvious is that this conclusion is not a conditional. And if you're doing hypothetical syllogism, the conclusion of hypothetical syllogism always has to be a conditional. All right, so what about this? If I went to the store, then I bought some milk. If I bought some milk, then I had some cereal. If I went to the store, then I had breakfast. Now you might think necessarily, if I had some cereal, then of course I had some breakfast, so isn't this okay? Well, that might be true. It might be true that if you had some cereal, then you bought some breakfast, but no, this is not the same thing. Remember, all your variables, your A's and your B's and your C's and your D's and your E's, all of those letters always have to match each other. And that means that the very last link in the chain has to match right here. Sorry, let me do that again. The very last link in the chain has to match right here, and it doesn't. Now you could add another link in the chain. In other words, you could add in there 8.1. If I had some cereal, then I had some breakfast. And then conclusion number 9 would work. Let's take a look at another example. If I went to the store, then I buy milk. If I buy milk, then I drink it. If I drink it, then I'm healthy. If I'm healthy, then I have a good life. If I go to the store, then I have a good life. Well, that's pretty funny conclusion, right? But this does fit the form of hypothetical syllogism exactly, because I told you that there can be a lot of links in the chain. And the very first link of the chain, right up here, is present in the conclusion where it's supposed to be. And the, and the last link in the chain is also present where it should be, according to the rule. Finally, our final rule, we have 4 rules, and we've looked at 3 of them so far. This is our final rule. This one is called disjunctive syllogism. This one is different because all the other rules involve at least one conditional, at least one if-then statement. But this rule doesn't have a conditional. It is using the word or to get started. So the first premise here, premise 10, says A or B. And then 11 says that B is not the case or B is false. And so then the conclusion that we're left with is A. And if you had 2 premises that fit this form, your conclusion would, using disjunctive syllogism, would fit this form. A way to think about this rule is you have 2 things, and what this premise is saying is that one of these 2 things is true. Either A is true or B is true. And then in the next premise, you kind of knock one of those out of the way. You're saying we're limited to 2 options here, and then you knock one of your options out of the way. And if you really have knocked it out of the way, then you're left with only one option, which is the option, in this case, what it's called is A. One thing to know about the form here is that it's fine. It is still disjunctive syllogism if the thing that you knock out of the way is the A instead of the B. So either one of those, it's still going to be disjunctive syllogism. That's perfectly fine. So here are examples of knocking either the A or the B out of the way. Here's the first one. Either I went to the store or I stayed home, but I didn't stay home. I'm knocking that one out of the way, so the only one I'm left over with is I went to the store. But you could go the other way. Either I went to the store or I stayed home. But I didn't go to the store. I'm knocking that one out of the way. So the one that I'm left with is that I stayed home. So is this disjunctive syllogism? Either I went to the store or I stayed home. I stayed home, so I didn't go to the store. That is not disjunctive syllogism, because you always, in your premise, you have to knock something out of the way. You have to negate something. You have to say that something is false. And in this case, 11 is saying that something is true, and then the conclusion is saying that something is false. And that's not the way this rule goes. It has to fit the form exactly. All right, so in your premise assignments, you are going to listen or read, really. You're going to read arguments that are just kind of normally stated. They're just written up, just like a conversation that you would have with a friend. And then you're going to take that argument, that reasoning that someone is giving you, and you are going to put it into premise form. You're going to say, maybe I can use disjunctive syllogism for this argument, or maybe I can use modus ponens for this argument, or maybe I have to use hypothetical syllogism and I have to use modus tollens to represent the argument that I'm looking at right now. So you use your rules, you put it into premise form, And then, once you're done with that, you have to pick a premise that you argue against or argue in favor of. And if you are going to argue against a conditional statement, that is, if you're going to argue against a premise that is an if-then statement, then these are some directions for you on how to do that. So what if you wanted to argue against a premise that said, if I went to the store, then I bought some milk? You're going to say, no, I think that's false. I want to argue against that. Here's what you need to know. Conditional statements are false if the stuff after the if and before the then is true, but the stuff after the then is false. Now that's kind of fancy. It might be intimidating. You might be really confused. Let's just look at this. It'll be pretty intuitive once we see. What I said there is that if the stuff in between the if and the then is true, but the stuff after the then is false, then the whole conditional is false. And this is very intuitive. You do this all the time without realizing it. So if you look at a statement and you say, if I went to the store, then I bought milk, you're going to say, wait a minute, sometimes I go to the store, but I don't buy milk. In other words, you're saying, wait a minute, sometimes I go to the store. In other words, that's true. The stuff in between the if and the then is true. But the stuff after the then is false. Even though I go to the store, even though that's true, I don't buy milk. That part is false. That means the whole conditional is itself false. So just remember, a conditional statement is false if and only if the antecedent, which is a fancy word for everything in between the if and the then, is true, but the consequent, and that's a fancy word for everything after the if, is false. So if I wanted to argue against number one, so let's say I wanted to argue against number one, here's how that would look. If I could have gone to the store but only bought bread, then it is false that if I went to the store, then I bought milk. And I really could have gone to the store but only bought bread. Therefore, it is false that if I went to the store, then I bought milk. And the rule you're using there is modus ponens. So when you're responding to an argument that you've put into premise form, you're going to respond to the argument in premise form with a premise form argument of your own, which means you need to cite rules when you do it. And in this case, you would be using the rule modus ponens. The premises that you're using are 1.1 and 1.2. So let's just take a look at this. This right here is the A slot. And that is word for word what you get in the second premise. So that fits the form exactly. And everything here is the B slot. It is false that if I went to the store, then I bought some milk. And that is word for word what you see in the B slot. So that fits the form of modus ponens exactly. And if you got that far, that would be fine. If you want to be a little picky, you can say, if 1.3 is true, then 1 is false. And 1.3 is true. Therefore, 1 is false, using modus ponens again. But you don't have to do that necessarily, but you can if you want to. I'm going to skip in this lecture how to argue against a disjunction. You're probably not going to do that too much, but you can look at it on your own because this document will be given to you, so you can look it over. Let me say a word here about the nature of the assignment, which you have in the syllabus, but which I'm also telling you about now in this video. Ignore this first day of class. Sometimes I do this in person with people. So that's not applicable right now. You're watching this in this video for the first time. The rule, one of the rules for the premise assignments that you're doing this semester is that you can only argue against a premise or you can only argue in favor of a premise, but you cannot argue in favor of a conclusion and you cannot argue against a conclusion. Why am I making that rule? One of the reasons is that if the um, the premises really do lead to a conclusion, let's say that you don't like that conclusion, you dislike it, it's morally not good in your eyes, or you think it's false. But if the premises really do logically lead to that conclusion, there has to be something wrong with the premises. And even though you might be able to find something like a good objection against the conclusion, the premises still lead to that conclusion, so you have to do something with those premises. There has to be something wrong with them, and you need to be able to figure out what's wrong with them. So that's one of the reasons why I require you to do that. Another reason is, I think, more important, and this has a lot to do with critical thinking, which is what this course is about. When you're listening to someone argue in favor of something that you don't like, or seems bad to you, or you think is false, or you maybe even think is dangerous, if you hear what they're saying and they get to their conclusion and you really don't like their conclusion and you react against their conclusion, maybe you even argue against their conclusion, but you never interact with their reasoning, that is not going to help, because from their point of view, their reasoning still makes sense. So you need to interact with the steps of reasoning that led them to that conclusion. You need to learn how to slow down, say, yeah, I don't like this argument, but I need to figure out what's wrong with the reasoning. I need to figure out what's wrong, in other words, with the premises of the argument and not just the conclusion. Some tips for when you're looking at, like I'm going to give you just arguments that you might hear with your friends or you might hear on the news. And what you want to watch out for are words like if and then. If you see something like that, you should probably think, oh yeah, that's probably a conditional. That means it's probably a premise in their argument. Watch out for the word or. These aren't foolproof. They don't always work, but these are tips. These are generally good things to look out for. They don't always work, remember, but oftentimes they do. If you see the word or, you might think maybe there's a disjunctive syllogism going on right here. And tip number 3 is probably the most important out of all of it, and I am going to illustrate this for you later on in the video. What's the conclusion? What is the author or the person speaking or writing? What is this person driving at? What are they getting at? What do they ultimately want me and other people to believe? What is their ultimate resting place? Figure that out. And once you've figured, okay, that's the conclusion, that's what I'm going to end with when I'm representing their argument. I'm going to end with, therefore, whatever their conclusion is, right? And then the question is, how did they get there? What were the steps of reasoning that they used? And what are the rules of logic that they used? Did they use modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, disjunctive syllogism? All right, now the final thing of this video. We are going to work on some examples together. And I just did a quick search before recording this video, and I came across this YouTube short. And here's something that I heard someone say. I don't necessarily agree with this or disagree. This is just an example of what someone said, and this is something that they were saying, and they weren't thinking about having a debate with someone. They were not thinking about putting their argument into premise form. They were just talking normally. But when people talk normally, they are always making arguments. Okay, so let's Let's just listen. This is something that's not word for word quotation. It's just inspired from something that I came across. Here's what this person said. I heard people saying that you shouldn't bring up past trauma because then everything just comes loose and you get overwhelmed and can't live a productive life. But then I thought, that's true. But at the same time, you have to do something with that trauma because it's still there. It doesn't go away. All right, so this is something that I heard someone say, and what we're going to do is this is actually two arguments, and that's why I've put the first argument in yellow highlight, and I've put the second argument in green highlight. And we're going to take a look at both of these arguments. All right, starting with the first one. And what we want to ask is, what is this person driving at in the argument that they're making? What is their ultimate conclusion? So let's go back up and look at it. I heard people saying that you shouldn't bring up past trauma because then everything just comes loose and you get overwhelmed and can't live a productive life. So what is the ultimate thing that this person wants others to believe or think? The ultimate thing they're driving at is that you shouldn't bring up past trauma. Everything else after that in the statement, all of this, is the reasoning. Those are the premises of the argument. But what this person wants people to believe is that you should not bring up past trauma. Now remember, I'm not saying I agree with this. We are just using this as an example of learning how to think about what other people are saying, even if we disagree. Okay, you shouldn't bring up past trauma. So, the first thing that you should do when you know that that's the conclusion is you write out that idea with the word therefore in front. So let's go ahead and do that. Therefore, you shouldn't bring up past trauma. Now what's going to happen is that there's going to be stuff that we write before this, and those are going to be the premises of the argument. So then the question is, okay, that's what that person believes, but why do they think that? And they think that because then everything just comes loose and you get overwhelmed and can't live a productive life. So what they're saying is that let's go down here. They're saying that if you do bring up past trauma, then everything comes loose. Let's just make sure that we're getting their wording correct. You get overwhelmed and you can't live a productive life. You get overwhelmed and you can't live a productive life. Now notice, they want to deny the idea that you bring up. They want to say, no, bringing up past trauma is bad. If you want to make it a little better, if you think you should bring up past trauma. And what they're saying, they want to say, no, you shouldn't bring up past trauma. They want to deny that. So what they're going to say is they're going to go for modus tollens. They're going to deny everything after the then. They're going to say, you shouldn't allow everything to come loose. You shouldn't allow yourself to get overwhelmed. And you should try to live a productive life. Notice how can't live a productive life. And so if you're trying to live a productive life, you are negating this idea of can't. You're saying no to the can't. And so here in this step, you have the negation of B. So now you put in your numbers. And as I said, this is going to be modus tollens. So you cite your rules, your rule, modus tollens, and the premises that you used. Everything in the A slot needs to be negated. Down here, you shouldn't bring up past trauma. And that's the negation of you should bring up past trauma. Everything in the B slot here also needs to be negated, which I have done in every place where B appears. You're negating the B in this case. Because the rule of modus tollens, you could go back and check, says if A then B, not B, or B is false. Therefore, A is false as well. Now, to complete your argument, or to complete your assignment, you would need to write here, okay, that's what that person is saying, but now I'm going to provide my own argument. So you label it, here's my argument, and you're going to think, okay, so let's say that you disagree and you think, no, you should bring up past trauma. Maybe you should do it in certain places and not other places, and you should do it in a healthy way, but you should bring up past trauma. So I disagree with this argument. So what premise? Because I can't argue against the conclusion, remember. So what premise am I going to argue against? Which premise do I think is false? Well, you could probably argue against both, but probably the one that's most plausible to argue against is number one. Is it true that just because you think you should bring up past trauma, then everything has to come loose and you have to get overwhelmed and you can't live a productive life? Is that really true? And here in this case, this is a great example because you are arguing against a conditional. You are arguing against this if-then statement. Remember our rule for doing that, which is this. Everything in between the if and the then has to be true, but everything after the then has to be false. So just because you think that sometimes you should bring up past trauma, I'm going to say, okay, let's grant that that's true. Does it follow the rest of it? And no, the rest of it doesn't follow. How are we going to show this? You could say something like this. If I bring up past trauma with my therapist in an environment that's helpful and supportive, then it is false that, and then what you're going to do is just copy and paste all of this, because this is what you are saying is false. You're going against number one. And so that's why I wrote in down here, it is false that, and you copy and paste that whole premise. So if I'm going to bring up past trauma with my therapist in an environment that's helpful and supportive, then it would be false that if you think you should bring up past trauma, then everything is going to come loose and you're going to get overwhelmed and you can't live a productive life. No, that's false. Okay, so that's good. That's the way we want it. We're using modus ponens right now. So then, in order to ensure that your A's and your B's match, I am going to copy and paste the A slot, which is what I'm doing right now. The A slot in premise 4, I've copied. I paste it down here in the B slot. And so you're basically saying, I do bring up past trauma with my therapist in an environment that's helpful and supportive, or you could modify it a little bit. You could say something like, I think people should bring up past trauma with their therapist, an environment that's helpful and supportive. And that means conclusion, so write the word therefore in front, and come up here, and everything in the B slot, which is everything that I've just selected, everything after the then, that's the B slot in this case. So I copy it, I come down here, I paste it down in there, and this is going to be modus ponens, and you're going to cite the premises 4 and 5. All right, so I think that's enough to get you started. Feel free to email me if you have questions. Feel free to watch this video as many times as you want. You can look at the document as well. You'll have like the actual document on D2L. Yeah, and we'll see how the semester goes. I'm going to give you comments on all your premise assignments. If those comments don't make sense or if they're frustrating, don't keep it inside. Let me know. Email me. Let's have a constructive conversation about it. All right, best of luck to you.